think. All right. Good morning, everyone, or almost afternoon. Welcome all to the Aula, especially to overseas guests and to those watching today's proceedings via live stream. A few items before we begin. First, we ask you to kindly silence your phones or turn them off so as not to disturb these proceedings. You may take photos, but please ensure that you do not have flash turned on. We also ask that you stay in your seats and refrain from moving around the space to take photos in consideration of those around you and those watching the live stream. You may applaud at the conclusion of the layman's talk, but we ask that you refrain from any further applause until the end of the ceremony. For anything that I have not covered, please follow directions from the beadle. Now, it is my sincerest pleasure to introduce UnYoung Gabriela Chavez-Baldini to give her layman's talk.
Hello and welcome. I'm UnYoung Chavez-Baldini, and I'll be presenting on my thesis, Across Boundaries, Transdiagnostic and Network Approaches to Psychopathology. Currently, psychopathology, which is a fancy term for mental illness and the study thereof, is conceptualized as separate categorical diagnoses, such as major depressive disorder, schizophrenia, and social anxiety disorder, each with their own diagnostic criteria used to determine the presence or absence of a disorder. Disorders are then treated as distinct entities with hard boundaries. There is, however, increased recognition that the boundaries between diagnoses can be fuzzy and that there can be overlap between the different categories. That makes it difficult in trying to find the factors that lead to or maintain specific diagnoses. We can, for example, consider a hypothetical patient, Sophia, who has expressed having numerous fears and anxieties in social situations, memory problems, feeling depressed almost every day, and as if she doesn't know herself. She was diagnosed with social anxiety disorder and major depressive disorder. She also experiences low self-esteem, which can be considered a shared symptom that also isn't a direct diagnostic criterion for either disorder. This is where the transdiagnostic approach comes in, which cuts across categorical diagnoses and potentially goes beyond them with the aim to improve how we conceptualize and treat psychopathology. The transdiagnostic approach assumes that there are shared characteristics and processes across different disorders, and that would be more useful to focus on the underlying dimensions of psychopathology. Low self-esteem can be considered a potential transdiagnostic dimension that could be a factor relevant to numerous diagnoses, meaning that if you tackle or treat low self-esteem, that it could potentially have an effect on numerous categorical disorders. Another main framework in my thesis is the network approach. The idea behind the network approach is that psychopathology occurs from the interaction of symptoms that are interconnected and influence each other. For Sophia, this means her low self-esteem leads to anxiety, which can lead to avoidance, and so forth. Over time, these symptoms can be a difficult, persistent pattern that is difficult to break out of. Some symptoms impact each other, such as with avoidance and sadness, and some symptoms just have a cascade effect impacting one symptom which leads to another symptom, and so forth. A network is made up of nodes, which are the different elements in a network, in this case, individual symptoms, and the edges, which are the arrows or the lines between the nodes and indicates the relationships between them. This is different from the current traditional approach called the latent model, in which it's believed that a disorder causes its symptoms. It's then assumed that a disorder is distinct from the symptoms. Such a model can work for some medical diseases, but this is a problem for psychopathology because psychiatric disorders can't be diagnosed without their symptoms. This is not the case for some diseases such as cancer, which can be asymptomatic. However, there aren't asymptomatic psychiatric disorders. The network theory therefore suggests that disorders don't exist as a separate entity from the symptoms. Instead, the symptoms are part of a larger whole. Therefore, the general aim of my thesis was to investigate the relationships between psychiatric dimensions using the transdiagnostic and network approaches. This may allow for a more granular understanding of how different factors underlying psychopathology may impact each other. This thesis is the product of the ACROSS study, a transdiagnostic research project carried out at the Department of Psychiatry of the Amsterdam UMC. It consists of the assessment of cognitive function, psychiatric symptoms, and a collection of various biological data in a sample of over 1,000 patients with various psychiatric disorders. Being the coordinator of the ACROSS study, I oversaw many of these activities and other day-to-day tasks. As you can see, I had a very hands-on approach. Here I am acting as a test subject to train my students. I had my scalp gelled for EG and haircut many times in the name of science. You can imagine my hairdresser not being very happy with that. As a result of our hard work, we assembled a diverse database, providing us with many research opportunities. Using data from the ACROSS study, we created 3 transdiagnostic networks. For each, I'll highlight a main finding. In our first network, which you can see here, we investigated the relationships between psychopathology symptoms, such as obsessive-compulsive symptoms or depressive symptoms, as well as substance use and cognitive function, such as verbal, memory, and attention. Our findings demonstrated that cognitive function, which are the purple nodes, and psychopathological symptoms, which are the blue nodes, are distinct yet interrelated dimensions. This supports the need to research and treat cognitive function in addition to symptoms and do so in a transdiagnostic manner rather than within specific disorders. In Sophia's case, this means that in addition to her anxiety, her memory problems should be directly addressed rather than assuming that tackling her anxiety symptoms would also improve her memory symptoms, as is usually the case. In the second network, we looked at the relationships between individual symptoms of 3 core dimensions: depressive, anxious, and psychotic symptoms. We found that relationships between different dimensions were common and interacted in ways that do not adhere to diagnostic categories. For Sophia, who was diagnosed with 2 separate disorders, this means that her anxious and depressive symptoms likely interact with each other despite being considered dimensions from different categorical diagnoses. Lastly, we explored the relationships between psychosis, depression, and anxiety, which are the blue nodes, and existential concerns, such as autonomy, recognition of disorder, social connection, and identity, which are the orange nodes. Here we found that identity and autonomy played a central role in the network, and that anxious and depressive symptoms were related to worse existential concerns. This shows that non-symptom dimensions, such as autonomy, can play an important role in psychopathology. In this case, Sophia's identity issues could then be considered an important non-symptom dimension that interacts with her depressive and anxious symptoms. So what does it all mean for psychiatry? Our findings support the need to rethink the assumption that diagnoses are distinct entities. Instead, we can focus on the shared processes underlying psychopathology to potentially streamline assessment and treatment. The prominent role of non-symptom dimensions also further supports the necessity of a more multifactorial or holistic approach to psychopathology and the interventions thereof, and a need for going beyond just focusing on the symptoms. Future studies can then, for example, work on incorporating aspects of positive health in addition to the symptoms to further promote quality of life and well-being in addition to symptom reduction. Thus, in summary, the findings of this thesis demonstrate that the transdiagnostic and network approaches can give new insights into relationships between psychiatric dimensions, some which don't receive as much attention as they should. Paradigm shifts ask us to take a moment to examine the way we think and operate, and these different approaches may stimulate us to view things in a way that departs from the status quo. Before concluding, I would like to take a moment to express my gratitude to my supervisors for their guidance, as well as to the Across Consortium and Department of Psychiatry for their collaboration. Thank you to my committee members for taking the time to read my thesis and partaking in this ceremony. And thank you to my family and friends, both in person and online, for being here and supporting me today and along my PhD journey. Thank you for your attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to the special meeting of the Doctorate Board of the University of Amsterdam at the occasion of the PhD defense of Mrs. Chavez-Baldini. Welcome. I just want to know if you all checked your phones. They are on mute. Then this is okay. Are you ready for this?
Yes.
Great. Then I will ask you to read the first part of the formula in front of you.
By authority of the Rector Magnificus and the Doctorate Board of this university, I shall, during this hour, in order to obtain the doctorate, publicly defend my thesis entitled Across Boundaries, Transdiagnostic and Network Approaches to Psychopathology. I entreat all those who wish to voice criticism of the contents of the thesis to do so in a truthful and lucid manner, so as to provide an opportunity for an ordered exchange of views.
Thank you. The opposition is going to be started by Professor De Haan. Professor De Haan is Professor in Psychiatry and Philosophy at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam, and the word is yours.
By virtue of my right, but not without permission of the Rector, I would like to have a discussion with you, esteemed candidate, about the content of your thesis. Dear UnYoung, congratulations with your PhD thesis. It's an impressive thesis, I think, and it really tries to do something innovative. And I enjoyed reading it a lot. And I would like to start with a general question. So you start your introduction with basically listing what's wrong with the DSM. I would like to ask you, could you maybe repeat what the issues with the DSM are, and say something about how you see that transdiagnostic and network models remedy that or avoid these issues.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your comments and your question. So as a summary of some of the assumptions around the DSM, a lot of the diagnoses within the DSM have become rarefied. So it is in that a lot of people treat these diagnostic categories as if they are real things, and that invites a lot of essentialism. So, for example, there's for many years of research, people have been trying to find the biological mechanism that explains disorders. And there's a lot of also heterogeneity within the diagnostic categories, which has led to some difficulties with research because people have so many different kinds of symptoms. And yeah, for a lot of these symptoms, it's not possible to find, or it's been difficult to find, a biological substrate. So even though in the DSM it has been stated, DSM-4 has been stated that these categorical diagnoses shouldn't be treated as essential, real things, it has become that way through research practices. And so a lot of symptoms outside of the DSM have fallen to the wayside, and you have a very more narrow approach to psychiatry. And with a transdiagnostic approach, I think one of the nice things is that it can introduce other elements beyond the DSM symptoms and criteria. And of course, in some ways, it's not a completely new or radical thing, because in the history of psychiatry, there have been also other dimensions that have been looked at, but the transdiagnostic approach really reminds us that we should look past just using the DSM. And with the network approach, it also brings into psychiatry a more dynamic approach, that disorders aren't just these static, hard categories, that these symptoms are all interacting with each other, and that we should really look at all these different components in relation to each other.
Thank you. So you mentioned heterogeneity and the reification problem, and one other element that you also mentioned is the tendency to recovery and remission becoming overly symptom focused. And I was wondering how you see this particular problem in the light of network models and transdiagnostic approaches. So, for instance, in your chapter 3, I think it is, you mentioned the centrality, for instance, of verbal memory in a network. So how can we prevent then this being again like, okay, let's focus on verbal memory, which sort of would be again a kind of reductive approach. So what are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. There has definitely been some scrutiny of centrality measures, and potentially being essentialist, and again, reducing it to that one. I do think that researchers and clinicians have to be mindful that these central symptoms should be seen in relation to the whole network. It's about the processes and the relationships, and it could be used more as a guiding. So it's not necessarily that psychopathology is all going to be solved by addressing verbal memory. So I do think there has to be some caution, and it is this essentialist idea and common cause idea, I think, is so ingrained that it still manages to slip in, even in approaches such as the network approach, which is moving away from that. So it is important to be cautious.
Yeah. So part of the reification problem may be in people doing that all the time rather than perceive the DSM. Yeah. Another question. So a philosopher of psychiatry, Justin Carson, just published a book, Madness, Philosophical Exploration, it's called, and he distinguishes between he says basically that looking at the history of thinking about psychiatric problems, he says there's two main strands of thinking. On the one hand, you have madness as dysfunction, and on the other hand, madness as strategy. And the madness as dysfunction is basically something has randomly gone wrong in someone's head, for instance, but it doesn't have a meaning. Whereas the madness as strategy variant, or sort of the approaches to psychiatric disorder, would mean that there is a reason to, there's a meaning to why someone acts in a certain way, and they see madness, in a sense, as a coping strategy. I was wondering, if you look at these two approaches, where would you position transdisciplinary and network models? Transdiagnostic, sorry.
I would say with the network approach, there is the principle of the network becomes or goes into a disordered state. That is one of the principles. So I suppose with the network approach, it would perhaps go more into the camp as madness as dysfunctional. But I don't think it has to be either or. And I think it's also going to be very personal for the individual. I know there are some people who, there's like mad pride, and they very, very much view madness as, it gave meaning to their life. And for some other people, it is, yes, this is what it is. I think the transdiagnostic approach could allow for both. It doesn't necessarily have to go for one or the other. That is the nice thing about the transdiagnostic approach, that it has that flexibility and can go more into those sort of either camp, I would say.
Yeah, so that's an advantage of these models. It may also be a bit of a downside of these models. And just, I think this has to be my final question, but so you give the example of Sophia in your final chapter. So Sophia is a young woman with a range of symptoms, anxiety, depressed mood, but also some persecutory thoughts and so on. And you analyze her case saying, okay, it's good that we have this transdiagnostic view, that we don't only look at generalized anxiety disorder and social anxiety disorder, and also the network approach allows us to see the interrelation, personal activities that people do, and maybe also related to meaning of life, for instance, is an example you give. But I was wondering, so what would be your take on why does Sophia develop these symptoms in the first place? And what would you think would be an answer to that from either a transdiagnostic or a network model approach?
Short answer, please.
Okay. I think with the complexity of psychology, there wouldn't be one single reason. If we want to look at more psychopathology as problems of living, then it could be that because of the impact of her symptoms on her life, that it became more into this state of disordered or dysfunction. But yeah, I think with the transdiagnostic and the network approaches, then you can include all of these other elements to look at the context of the person. But yes, as to a specific reason why, yeah, I think that's difficult.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, the opposition is going to be continued by Dr. Wichmann. Dr. Wichmann works at the University Medical Center in Groningen, and her tasks as the early development of psychosis. And the word is yours.
By virtue of my right, but not without permission of the rector, I would like to have a discussion with you, esteemed candidate, about the content of your thesis. Oops. But first, let me congratulate you with this great achievement of this beautiful thesis, of course, to you and your team. It is clear that you've performed excellent research, a lot of deep thinking and a lot of diving into complex statistical models. And I particularly admire your advocacy to focus more on existential and recovery domains in mental health. So let me start with chapter 5. One important finding in this study is the role of self-view that you identified. And you discussed this in light of the SCAR hypothesis, which states that having experienced mental health problems may have a negative impact on your perception of yourself. And I was thinking about how this finding may relate to the nature of your population, which you also discuss, of course. The population is recruited from a tertiary care institution and thus includes people with established, often long-term mental health problems. And I was wondering if you would expect similar results in people in other stages of illness. So, for example, in people with the first episode of psychosis, for example, or recently diagnosed anxiety disorder, or people at risk even. Because in individuals at risk, you might expect more support for the vulnerability model, perhaps. So my question is, what are your thoughts on the role of stage of illness or clinical staging in this finding? And what are your thoughts on this role?
Esteemed opponent, thank you for your comments and your question. I think that is definitely plays a role because indeed the AMSA is a tertiary institution. So it is possible that because we found rather than self-view being more of a risk factor or a predictor, we found that it was an outcome, which is a bit different from a lot of the other findings. So I do think that plays a role because these patients then have more severe cases. And I think ideally, if we had a sort of severity indicator to be able to create subgroups to see if there are differences between the networks, and it could be that in groups with lower severity or a first episode, it could be that actually self-view is more of the predictor, has more highly influential in the network rather than highly influenced. So ideally, yes, we would have had some sort of general severity indicator to make some subgroups and see if that holds across stages of the staging of psychopathology.
Thank you very much. And what are your thoughts on applying this transdiagnostic approach in earlier stages? Would you expect strong differences there, or would you expect like stronger networks or more associations? Any thoughts on that?
For earlier stages. Mm-hmm. For earlier stages, I suspect it tends to be more transdiagnostic. So I would suspect that there would be a bit more similarities in the networks. And then it would become more individualized or different as severity goes on. So with earlier stages, it tends to be more early potential. So you start off with a lot of general symptoms, and then as it goes on, it'll go into more specific profiles and trajectories.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. Thank you very much. I have a second question for you, of course. Because on page 148, you write, suffering due to psychopathology can be considered transdiagnostic. And I found that an intriguing statement. And although I in principle agree with it, I was wondering if all domains trigger this experience of suffering in similar ways. So put slightly differently, do people with psychosis suffer in different ways than people with anxiety, for example? And I do not mean in terms of which disorder is more severe or not, but really in terms of the experience. Can we compare this, or are there different aspects of suffering that we would study? What are your thoughts on this?
I imagine there would be some differences also because of a lot of societal influences. Psychosis, for example, still tends to be viewed in society quite negatively, and it can introduce a lot of self-stigma, which that can also prevent someone from recovering or really participating in society, and also stigma from others as a barrier. Whereas I imagine for disorders such as anxiety, which is especially now more well known, and people view it more as not a normal thing per se, but it is more widely accepted. So I do think there will be differences in the experience and the kind of suffering that a patient would experience according to their disorder.
And how would you ideally study these differences of different symptoms? Do you have any ideas on how you would study this if you would have like a very nice grant, for example?
I would definitely like to take a more complex systems approach to really take into account also more outside external influences. But I think even with a sort of experience sampling method, there are already questions on social context, for example, that could give some insight into how someone perceives their social environment, how they are, so how people act towards them, and how that could have an influence on their symptoms. But also we could include other dimensions of general everyday functioning and well-being. So you could go from more micro ESM daily reports with the social context to really taking into account more environmental factors in a complex systems model.
So a lot more fine-grained, trying to map daily life and perhaps even also qualitative research methods.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, well, very nice ideas.
Afraid your time.
I'm time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The opposition is going to be continued by Professor Swinkels. Swinkels is Emeritus Professor in Psychiatry at the Amsterdam University. The word is yours.
First, I want to congratulate you. I have to read by virtue of my right, but not without permission of the rector, I would like to have a discussion with you, esteemed candidate, about the content of your thesis. And I want to congratulate you first, because I think every attempt to get more information on psychopathology is a good one, because it can lead us to better treatments. First, I want to discuss with you at chapter 1. You said shortcomings of the current psychiatric paradigm, which means that the framework in psychiatry, which contains the basic assumptions, ways of thinking and methodology commonly accepted by psychiatrists, has shortcomings. Of course they have. But it can also be that you don't fully understand the way psychiatrists work. So, the DSM-5 is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and it is in the Netherlands called an instruction for the classification of mental disorders. And a disorder is a disturbance of normal functioning of the mind or the body. The DSM-5 contains a lot of behaviors what are statistically different from normal functioning. But it is only as a rule a disease or an illness if it gives clinical significant dysfunction. The spider phobia is a clinical syndrome if you suffer from it. If you don't suffer from it, you have no illness. Question to you is, what is the meaning of diagnostics in the USA compared to the Dutch and more European approach of diagnostics? Have an answer on that.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your comments and your question. I would say in the US, the DSM certainly is entrenched in every aspect. A lot of the DSM research started in the US as well. Of course, at least experienced and well-trained clinicians know that the DSM is not the only source, and with clinical conceptualization, there are going to be other dimensions that are going to be considered, such as personality factors, coping mechanisms. So a well-trained clinician would not only use DSM. In terms of research, at least I would say in the Netherlands, the DSM has a less strong grip than in the US, although in the US it is also changing, but in research it is still very much used as the base for sample selection, for example, and some methodology.
Yeah. Okay, to categorize abnormal behavior, groups or syndromes is an American way.
Sorry?
Is an American way
Yes.
of doing. You have a group of symptoms and we call it schizophrenia.
Right, yes.
That doesn't exist, but it is a construct.
Right.
Patients can have that construct and suffer from it, but that's the DSM. And in the Netherlands or in Europe, you have the etiology, the medical model is the etiology, the pathogenesis, and physical and psychological, which leads to symptoms, and that's have a course. There's a much more complicated system with a lot more information as a psychiatrist you have to get before you can make a diagnostic. And from the diagnostic comes the treatment. And you understand that that gives a lot of information, but you can never have with a kind of system approach. You have to have thousands and thousands of questions. Dus the clinical approach is also a kind of categorizing all kinds of systems, a kind of. Can you systematically do that in your approach? All that information we need to make a diagnosis.
Yes, I think it's still at the earlier stages, and there are, at the moment, with the transdiagnostic approach, there's the soft approach and the hard approach, and the soft approach is still using these classifications and trying to find the shared processes between them, and the hard approach, which I don't think we're anywhere near at the moment, is really conceptualizing classification in a totally new way. With the network approach, it can still be incorporated into the current system. So clinicians already have their own theories and ideas of the relationships between symptoms. The network approach, you could then do it in a data-driven way, and you could really see exactly what the relationships between the symptoms are.
Okay. I give my word back to the director. Thank you for your.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. The opposition is going to be continued by Professor Borsboom. Professor Borsboom is professor in the Faculty of Maatschappij en Gedragswetenschappen at the University of Amsterdam. En zijn leeropdracht is psychologische methodeleer. And I give you the word.
By virtue of my rights, but not without permission of the rector, I would like to have a discussion with you, esteemed candidate, about the content of your thesis. First, I would also like to congratulate you. You developed several innovative lines of analyzing psychopathology from a transdiagnostic perspective, and I'm really enthusiastic about the way that you have used network analysis to help you with that. And I would also like to compliment you from a methodological perspective, because I was really impressed by the very, very extensive robustness analyses that you have done. I think that is really, really good, and I often miss that in statistical analyses, and that really adds strength to your analyses. So we've seen hundreds, if not thousands, of network analyses of psychopathology symptoms in the past decade. And as for me, surprising result is that in general, what you see in these networks is that they are what psychometricians call positively associated, which means that if you recode all of the symptoms or nodes such that higher scores are worse, all the connections in the network become positive. So you get these green spaghetti graphs, basically. And that's actually consistent with the central idea of the theory, the network theory, which is that problems cause and sustain each other and then culminate in a sort of stable state where all these problems keep on activating each other. But in the transdiagnostic network analysis that you report with cognitive factors in chapter 3, this doesn't seem to be the case. it seems to me that if you recode, you didn't do that, but if I, recode in my head, the cognitive factors as higher is worse, then the network does not become positively associated. And you also notice this yourself implicitly when you say that on page 52, interestingly, we found that nodes representing psychopathology tended to have consistent relationships with cognitive domains, and also with each other, by the way, while nodes representing cognitive domains had mixed relationships with psychopathology. For instance, depression was consistently related to worse functioning across cognitive domains. However, verbal memory functioning, a cognitive node, had different relationships to psychopathology domains. For instance, subclinical psychotic experiences were related to worse verbal memory, whereas obsessions and compulsions were related to better verbal memory. So here you see violations of positivity. And that is because psychosis and obsessions and compulsions are themselves positively associated. So what you have here is what's sometimes called a forbidden triangle, which you have when you have two friends and they are enemies. Right? So that's you are positively with one friend and you are positive with the other friend, but they are negative together. And this is also what you see here. You also see this with alcohol and cannabis use, where you see that alcohol use has only positive relations with cognitive functioning, which, by the way, I found quite surprising. And cannabis had only negative ones, and that was even more pronounced in the subsample analysis on page 78. So this is really different from what I've seen so far, and these results are much more variable and differentiated than you would normally see, and that seems to suggest that the role played by declining cognitive functions is not the role played by psychopathology symptoms, where you get, more problems, more problems, more problems. Apparently, sometimes better cognition relates to worse psychopathology. So I'm interested to hear whether you think this is a real result, whether you think there are maybe confounders that produce these patterns of relationships, and whether you can actually make sense of this from a clinical or psychopathology point of view.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your comments and your questions. I also found it very interesting, these differential relationships. I think that they do have a reflection in reality. With alcohol use, for example, I definitely think there is a sort of confounder. So one idea that I was thinking about is, well, first of all, the alcohol use was pretty moderate in this group. So that can play a role. And you can also think about alcohol use. What is the role of alcohol use? And in social situations, for example, people will drink alcohol, and if you're thinking about verbal memory, the more verbal you are, the better relationships you can have. It can be some kind of, so the social situation could be a sort of confounder, so it could even be more of a psychosocial functioning that could play a role in this. And with the obsessive compulsive symptoms being related to a couple of better cognitive functions, you do see, for example, that people with obsessive compulsive disorders tend to be a bit higher IQ, a bit more intelligent, so that could play a role. More of these individual characteristics could play a role in this relationship, whereas with subclinical psychosis tend to have more lower premorbid IQ and intelligence. So I think there are definitely some other elements here at play explaining these relationships, but I do think it's not something strange that came out.
Thank you. If I build a simulation model, which is something we often do, and I would run that for a psychopathology network, then, if something gets worse and the other thing gets worse, and if that model is true, which we of course never know, but suppose that model is true, then an intervention that treats the system is, to either take out nodes or take out links But in the, you now discussed a number of possible confounders. But if I would drive the idea that you have these forbidden triangles with the cognitions, then the implication would be that some areas of psychopathology would benefit from reducing cognitive functioning. So if I made the memories, if I screwed around with the memories of the people with OCD, that would actually, that would be beneficial. Is there any, and of course in the complex systems literature, these kinds of things are known. Sometimes you have very counterintuitive effects in these big networks. So is this something that makes any sense, or is this just something that's so bizarre that you would say, well, this must be a false positive or a confounder?
I think in some cases it can make sense. So with selective attention, for example, and it is something that I also mentioned in my last chapter, that there are sometimes a lack of looking at the direction. So attention in one group, if it's very good attention, but if you're focusing on a maladaptive content, for example, that high functioning attention is then can be problematic. So I think focusing on the content is also important, rather than just looking at, well, this is out of the range, but in a positive manner. So I think it is possible to have very good attention, but then if you're very focused on maladaptive contents, then it can lead to problems.
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's really interesting. So I could actually, if I set up a simulation model like that, it would be a possibility. That's quite fascinating, and also suggests that we should really think differently about the role in cognition relative to psychopathology symptoms. And so if I'm on this train anyway about how to simulate things, one of the other things I found very interesting in chapter 6, where you discuss a network of existential factors in psychopathology, is that you find this big link between recognition of the disorder and anxiety, I think. And then you say that this is can be related to the insight paradox, where you realize you have a problem and this actually makes things worse. And so now I'm thinking, if I made a simulation model where the networks are all the nodes are influencing each other, and then the network visits a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist says to the network, you suffer from OCD, or you suffer from schizophrenia, or whatever. What do I then put into what should I put into the model? Should I just take the diagnosis as a readout of the system, just a measurement that doesn't do anything, but just, just like I can measure your height, it doesn't do anything to your height? Or should I include the diagnosis? Can the diagnosis itself become a factor in the network, so that it's sort of drawn into the network structure and starts playing a causal role in there? And can that causal role be bad? And what's the implication of that?
I certainly think that the relationship to the diagnosis that a patient can get could definitely play an influential role in the network. And of course, I think that would be better played out in more personalized models, because for some people it might be okay, and for others they might really know that they have a disorder and feel very bad about it. I think, just the disorder itself may not have as much content-wise or context-wise role in the network. And I think there could also be, if you look at it temporally, it could be very different, because there are some observations of when you're starting treatment and you first get your diagnosis for some individuals, then it can be very difficult. You're starting to realize these things about yourself. So it sometimes seems like things get worse before they get better, and then perhaps along the treatment trajectory, then things will start to resolve with some treatment.
Okay. The next opponent is Professor Rietveld. Professor Rietveld is a professor in development of human technology at the University of Amsterdam, location Amsterdam UMC, and the word is yours.
By virtue of my right, but not without permission of the rector, I would like to have a discussion with you, esteemed candidate, about the content of your thesis. I would first like to say that I really appreciate your dynamical systems approach to psychiatry, and I think it's very needed and that you make the important step, so congratulations on the dissertation. In the final chapter of your dissertation, you discussed the hypothetical patient Sophia, and give an example about the implications of the network approach for the treatment practice. And both of my questions are on the treatment practice, actually. In the paragraph Future Direction of that final chapter, you remark that it's important not to overburden patients in an attempt to get all relevant variables inside. And I wonder if by this personalized approach, we should also not worry about overburdening the treating psychiatrists, because they need to get a grip on so many variables, and they have typically very limited amounts of time for patients. How do you see this issue?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your comments and your questions. I think that is definitely has been a barrier with, for example, also the dimensional approach in implementing that, because then you have to do all these new trainings, and certainly with the network approach, you have to know some sort of statistics, understand how to interpret the network. So I think that could definitely be a barrier, and I do see, I supervise a lot of interns, and statistics was the scariest thing to them always. So you already see that in the training. I do think you can, for example, with a dynamical system in the research, focus on more of the different components, and then of course use as much of monitoring for like wearing the watches, for example, that monitors certain like actigraphy already without having to do much work. So there is a difference, I think, with the research dynamical aspect and the more treatment or clinical dynamical aspect. I think inside the clinic, you're going to really have to reduce what you're looking at really for that one patient. There have been some like feasibility trials, for example, with more experience sampling method and building networks out of that. And many patients tend to find that is doable. And there are, for example, apps now coming out that does a lot of the modeling for the clinicians. So there are strides being made, but I think it's certainly, it can certainly be a barrier. It also in the terms for clinicians, also in the terms of, oh, it's another thing that I have to worry about now.
But you do have all these statistical skills yourself, and still you need to use a hypothetical patient. How many years will it take for us to see a personalized approach for a real-life patient, taking all their relevant variables into account?
There are already some trials, as I'm aware, with implementing the network models in clinical practice. So it's already happening in the big scale, as these things do tend to move slowly. Perhaps within the coming decade, then being implemented more frequently. And you also don't have to, as I mentioned before, with the soft and the hard approach of the transdiagnostic method, you could incorporate networks into already existing treatments. You don't have to come up with something entirely new. So it doesn't have to be a whole at once reimagining everything. But perhaps in the maybe coming 5 years, there will be more substantial evidence for this in practice, and in the coming decade, this being incorporated into training and the clinic.
Thank you. My final question. In your interesting chapter 6 on existential concerns in psychiatry, there's a discussion paragraph that had a sentence that made me think on page 171. And it says, further research is necessary to differentiate between general existential concerns and psychopathology to avoid overtreatment and give opportunity for personal growth. And I was wondering if this issue of potential overtreatment of patients is what it's based on. Do you really see it happening in practice at the AMC? Because in my experience, existential concerns are often not getting that much attention. So did you encounter cases of them being over-treated, the patients' existential concerns?
I personally have not, but I do know that some existential concerns can be viewed as an issue rather than a normal part of going through life. So that is one thing that I did put that in there as a caution, so that, for example, there can be other interventions like social prescribing, for example, to help resolve some of those existential concerns and not have to go into a full line of treatment. So it isn't something that I've observed myself, but it is something that I know happens at times, so it is more of a cautionary, like, yes, these are things that people contend with. And
Okay, clear. Thank you very much.
thank you.
Dear candidate, you've heard your arrest, which means that the discussion is closed now. I would like to request you to read the second part of the formula in front of you.
Having thus concluded the defense of my thesis to the best of my ability, and pending the decision of the doctorate committee, I should like to express my sincere thanks to my highly esteemed supervisors in particular, as well as to those who have so courteously brought forward their criticisms, and to all who have honored the ceremony with their presence.
Thank you. The committee retires for deliberations. Esteemed candidate, after due consideration of the thesis you have submitted, we've decided to grant you the doctoral degree. Professor Denise is authorized to confirm this dignity upon you in customary fashion.
I most willingly accept the task assigned to me by the Rector Magnificus of the University. By virtue of our conference by law and in accordance with the decision of the Rector and the Doctorate Board of the University of Amsterdam, I hereby confer upon you, UnYoung, Gabriela, Chavez-Baldini, the degree of doctor, and grant you all the rights pertaining thereto by law or custom. In evidence hereof, you will be presented with the degree certificate signed by the Rector and the supervisors and confirmed with the Great Seal of the University. Having thus fulfilled the task assigned to me, I have the honor of being the first to address you as a doctor and to congratulate you with the dignity conferred on you. And the personal address will be done.
Zeer geleerde Dr. Chavez-Baldini, beste UnYoung, congratulations. Van harte gefeliciteerd met je prachtige proefschrift. Daar sta je dan. Geboren in Honduras, opgegroeid in Latijns-Amerika en Florida, maar nu hier in het sprankelende Amsterdamse leven, waar jij je weg helemaal gevonden hebt. Een jonge, zelfstandige, ambitieuze, bescheiden en betrokken vrouw die alles op alles heeft gezet om zich in korte tijd helemaal eigen te voelen in Nederland. Je leerde heel snel onze taal en de supervisie deden we dan ook geheel in het Nederlands. Ondernemend, daadkrachtig en niet bang voor grote levensveranderingen. Want wie vertrekt er nou uit de VS naar een klein, nat en koud landje zoals Nederland, om daar in eerste instantie een research master te gaan doen en vervolgens als projectleider en PhD bij ons aan de slag te gaan? Aan jou was dat helemaal besteed. Jij ontdekte snel die typische Hollandse dingen die je zeer waardeert. Namelijk lekker dat je op je fiets naar vrienden kan en naar de winkel. Wat makkelijk dat het allemaal in de buurt is. Je begon in Florida met een dubbele bachelor psychologie en sociologie, waar je in 2014 summa cum laude voor slaagde. In 2017 rondde je cum laude master cognitive and clinical neuroscience af in Maastricht. En dit combineerde je met allerlei onderzoeksactiviteiten. Allereerst bij de afdeling psychiatrie en psychologie in Maastricht en later bij het interdisciplinaire centrum voor psychopathologie en emotieregulatie van het UMCG in Groningen. En deze onderzoeksactiviteiten resulteerden in 3 mooie publicaties in wetenschappelijke tijdschriften. Daarnaast speelde je viool op hoog niveau in het Florida State Campus Orchestra en later het Universiteitsorkest in Maastricht. Terugkijkend, op maandag 27 november 2017 spraken Dorien Nieman en ik jou in een sollicitatiegesprek. En per januari 2018 kon je aan de slag gaan als projectleider van ons Across-onderzoek met het opzetten van een biobank. Waarin psychiaters en psychologen van alle verschillende expertisegebieden binnen het Amsterdam UMC-locatie AMC patiënten verzamelden met alle verschillende diagnoses. In de afgelopen 4 jaar ging jij overtuigend en welvarend aan de slag met het includeren van ruim 1200 patiënten in deze biobank. En jij begeleidde maar liefst 38 masterstudenten die meehielpen met de dataverzameling en ook bij het schrijven van hun scripties over de data uit deze biobank. En natuurlijk startte jij jouw promotieonderzoek. Samen met Dorien Nieman en onder de inspirerende leiding van Damiaan Denise hebben wij ons verdiept in mogelijkheden om deze unieke data te gebruiken voor een nieuw perspectief op de psychiatrie. Zo heb jij jezelf een nieuwe manier van onderzoek moeten aanleren met netwerkanalyses. Er was beperkte ervaring hiermee binnen het Amsterdam UMC, dus jij moest vooral zelf aan de slag. En schoolde jezelf ook online in deze complexe analyses om ze te kunnen begrijpen en uitvoeren. Uitdagingen en ontwikkelen. Een nieuw perspectief op de psychiatrie. Niet denken vanuit de bestaande klassificaties van psychiatrische ziektebeelden, maar op zoek gaan naar manieren om patiënten beter te begrijpen en ieder uniek verhaal van elke patiënt in zijn geheel mee te nemen. Welke onderliggende, overstijgende of gemeenschappelijke dimensies van ons psychisch welzijn kunnen we ontdekken bij patiënten, om zodoende behandelingen veel specifieker te kunnen laten aansluiten bij datgene waar de patiënt werkelijk onder lijdt en hulp bij wil. Een toekomstdroom, waar jij met dit proefschrift een eerste stap in hebt gezet. En dat gaat niet zonder slag of stoot. Gelukkig zijn er andere onderzoekers, zoals een van de commissieleden hier aanwezig, professor Borsboom, die deze nieuwe benadering van netwerkanalyses heeft ontwikkeld en op de kaart heeft gezet. Echter, lang niet alle reviewers van de door jou ingediende papers kenden deze methode. En om jouw artikelen geaccepteerd te krijgen, moest je vele reviewers overtuigen van dit nieuwe perspectief en hen meekrijgen in de visie dat we zo tot nieuwe inzichten in de psychiatrie kunnen komen. Een andere uitdaging was corona, waardoor het includeren van patiënten in de biobank moeizamer verliep. Maar tot vertraging van je onderzoek heeft dat echter niet geleid. Wel moest onze supervisie daardoor grotendeels online verlopen. En heb jij veel werk vanuit jouw woonplaats Utrecht moeten doen. Desondanks liet je je niet uit het veld slaan. En beter gezegd, lag jouw eerste artikel al binnen het eerste jaar van jouw aanstelling in onze mailbox klaar. Ongelooflijk hoe jij al deze taken combineerde, coördineerde en de resultaten er binnen een mum van tijd waren. Ondanks corona heb je deze resultaten op enkele congressen mogen presenteren en zijn er steeds meer onderzoekers en klinici die geloven in de waarde van nieuwe perspectieven binnen de psychiatrie. Natuurlijk hield je ook goed contact met je familie. En zo ben je voor de laatste fase van het afronden van je proefschrift nog enkele maanden terug naar Florida gegaan om vanuit daar je proefschrift af te ronden. Echter, dat heeft je er niet van kunnen overtuigen dat je in Florida wil blijven. Je bent teruggekomen en zet nu alles op alles om een nieuwe baan hier in Nederland te vinden en vanuit een meer sociaal-maatschappelijk perspectief als postdoc en misschien docent aan de slag te gaan. En jouw ouders zijn nu speciaal uit Florida naar Nederland gekomen om hier bij deze feestelijke gebeurtenis aanwezig te zijn. A special warm welcome to Mr. and Mrs. Chavez-Baldini. UnYoung, terug naar jou en jouw prachtige proefschrift. Zoals de omslag van je proefschrift visualiseert, ben jij op zoek gegaan naar de verbinding tussen alle verschillende knopen in lichaam en geest, die verbonden zijn met psychisch lijden en met elkaar. Jij bent een verbinder die twee culturen heeft weten te verbinden, net als patiënten en psychiaters en psychologen die zich bezighouden met heel verschillende ziektebeelden op onze afdeling. En nu ben jij zelfs direct verbonden met je eigen proefschrift. Kijk naar jouw mooie blauwe haar, de kleur van jouw proefschrift. Daar is lef voor nodig. En met jouw eigenschappen van lef, ambitie, verbondenheid en daadkracht wens ik jou een prachtige toekomst als postdoc-onderzoeker hier nu in Nederland en waarmee het vast nog heel ver gaat stappen. Ik geef het woord graag terug aan de promotor.
Regard the obtained dignity as an honor and a privilege, and never forget the attendant responsibilities which you now bear towards science and society.
It's a very pleasant duty, most learned scholar, to congratulate you also on behalf of the Doctoral Board of the University of Amsterdam on this newly acquired honor. And hereby I declare this ceremony closed, and now you can clap.